This is a very real phenomenon that for the past 30 years has been taking the world by storm, and it can't be ignored. I myself too had a profound experience that allowed me to believe the testimonies in this video. Not only have I researched each and every one of them, and they are airtight, but before I even heard of a near-death experience, I experienced something phenomenal that I'm going to share in a moment. The evidence is not in so much that these people are just describing that they visited heaven. That in itself is just subjective hearsay. It's the things that they describe while outside of their bodies, things that they could have not known otherwise. This is why so many nurses all over the world acknowledge this phenomenon to be real, because they've seen and heard things that these patients say while coming back to the physical world. Nurses are the first ones that the patients see when they come back to this world, and they are usually the first ones to hear these experiences. Here, I'm going to take off my jacket for a moment. So I encourage all of you watching this video, don't just buy into what the mainstream skeptics have to say about these experiences, because there's no way that any of them could know anything about the thing that they're denying. Because if they did know about it, they would be convinced of the fact that this is reality. The people who actually know these patients, the people who actually see these patients and hear the things they have to say when they come out of coma or are revived back to life after a heart attack or whatever, they know that this phenomenon is real, that it has reality to it. So I encourage all of you, do your own research. Many of the people in this video have very respectable careers. Eben Alexander, for instance, is a former skeptic and a neurosurgeon, so he knows that this is not simply a brain-based phenomenon. So some of you have already heard this story that I'm about to share. I'm just going to touch on it very briefly because of time. This video is already very long, and it's very important that I share this. And for those of you who have already heard this story, listen to it anyway, because there are necessary aspects about this story that correlate with near-death experiences that you need to hear. So in the summer of 2015, I lost my job, I lost the house, the super nice house next to my cousin, and I lost a bunch of other stuff that were very important to me. I was living in a little concrete cube on the highway without a bathroom, and the only source of water was the spigot outside the door, which was not an external door, it was an interior door, but it was used for the outside of this cube that I was living in. So mice would crawl in and puddles would slip into the room. It wasn't a very pleasant place to live. There was also another thing that had me crushed for weeks. I've talked about it in past videos, but for the sake of time in this video, I'm going to leave it out. So long story short, out of desperation, I went to a church on a Sunday morning in August of 2015. I was absolutely intimidated by the entire experience. They asked us to stand during the worship, and I remained seated because I did not want to participate in any of this. But out of complete desperation, with my fingers interlaced and I was looking at my feet, for the first time in 23 years in my entire life, I actually asked God if he was real for the first time. And I needed him to be real because I was hopeless in that moment. I was miserable. So I said, Jesus, I don't know if you're real. I don't know if I believe in you. But if you are real, I want to know. I need to know. I need you now. I absolutely did not expect anything to happen at all. I thought that if anything, he would show me in some vague, subtle way within the next few days or something. But what happened next, it startled me. It caught me off guard. To my amazement, I was overwhelmed with a very spiritual sensation of being cradled by pure, I want to say unconditional love, but it was so much more than that. It was as if I could step into his eyes and see myself from his perspective. Not physical perspective, but emotional perspective. And I could feel how he felt for me. It wasn't an out-of-body experience. I could just feel that he had overwhelming compassion for me. It was just, while I was at that church, it felt like, and this sounds nonsensical, but it felt like I was being embraced and wrapped up by pure acceptance, which sounds like nonsense. Total acceptance for who I was, just as I was. But much deeper than that, my favorite part about the entire experience was that not only in that moment did I know that he would fix all these problems that have been on my mind lately. I knew it's almost like I could see the future. I knew exactly how and when everything was going to come back together. At first, I didn't trust the intuition that I was experiencing. I didn't trust that what I was predicting would actually happen, but it turns out it did happen exactly as I thought it would. But not only that, I knew that even if he didn't fix my life or repair what was broken, I knew that I would still be okay. And more specifically, I knew that he would make sure that I was okay, because again, I felt as though I was in his perspective and I could feel what he felt for me, which is incredible. It's an amazing amazing feeling. So I knew that I would be okay. I knew that I would be more than okay. I knew that I would be perfect. Everything would be perfect no matter what happens, even if the world exploded. I knew that this person was going to make sure that I was okay. And it was an overwhelming feeling. And I knew in that moment that beyond a doubt, Jesus, God, whatever you want to call him, I knew that he was real. Like, there was no discussing it. Like, in that moment, it's not like I'm just seeing God. Again, I didn't hear any voices. It's just that I was so overwhelmed with the sense of seeing myself, not like visually, but like emotionally, seeing myself from his perspective. And I knew that he exists because I was a part of him. It's so hard to explain. I knew beyond a doubt that he was real in that moment. There was no two ways about it. And it wasn't because I called out to him that I knew Jesus was real. It was because I remembered him somehow, which sounds like it doesn't make any sense. I recognized him. Like, I recognized his presence. And I felt like I had known him for thousands of years, even though I had only been alive for 23. I recognized his presence the same way I would recognize my mother in heaven. I recognized him because I had known him before, and I forgot. Call it reincarnation, call it God consciousness, call it whatever you want. I don't know about all that. All I know is that I felt like I had known him for eons. I knew it was him because I recognized him. I recognized what he felt like. It was like I was hearing a familiar song, or smelling a familiar scent, or seeing a familiar face, but I didn't see anything. I just felt overwhelmed with pure, unconditional love and acceptance. It felt like I was the most precious person in the world to him. Like, he loved me more than anyone else. And I know that sounds conceited, but what I learned from, I still, at this time, I still had never heard of an NDE or an STE or an OBE. I heard a little bit about astral projection and out-of-body experiences, but after researching these experiences, I realized that this is exactly what everyone feels. And that experience changed my life forever. I was a completely different Devin after that. I was in love with God from that day until now. My family knows me before then. They knew me when I was 23. They knew me when I was 5. They knew me when I was 6. They knew me when I was 12. They knew that me and God, that I had no concept of God at all. That nothing about my life was about God. It was about science and the universe and geology and biological evolution and molecular biology and cosmology. But it was never about God. It was never about theology. So later I would learn that what I experienced had a name. I experienced something called a spiritually transformative experience, or STE. Everything has an abbreviation now when it comes to this phenomenon. But after I researched near-death experiences, I noticed a strong similarity between what I experienced and what they were trying to describe, what they were trying to put into words. There was a strong similarity between what they were describing and what I experienced that day at the church. I noticed them describing being held or embraced or cradled by unconditional love. I noticed that they were describing being filled with overwhelming peace and reassurance and comfort. I noticed that they said that they didn't hear a voice. They just knew that they knew that they knew that who they were seeing was God, almost telepathically, and that they had somehow known this man of light for thousands of years. So for me, when I hear people say that these near-death experiences are merely psychological, or that people experience different near-death experiences around the world depending on their culture, or when people say that they're just a result of DMT, I think back to that day and I realize that I didn't take any drugs, and I didn't die, and I didn't have an out-of-body experience. All I did was I asked Jesus if he was real. That's all I did. And I really, really needed him. I really wanted him. There's a verse in, I believe it's either in Proverbs or Psalms, and it says, God is close to the brokenhearted, and he saves those who are crushed in spirit. I was crushed in spirit. He saved me. He changed my life. He didn't just take away my misery in what was going on in my life at that time. He did that, but he also changed the rest of my life forever. Like Evan Alexander said, even when people just experience briefly this unconditional love, just a little bit of it, it changes their life forever. And I experienced a lot of it. And I experienced it without taking DMT, without taking any hallucinogenics, without taking any stimulants, and without having to die or have an out-of-body experience. And yet I experienced exactly what those people experienced. Exactly. It's identical. When I hear them describe it, I see them struggling to describe something that it's so hard to put into words, but I feel for them because I experienced the same thing. I experienced the same presence of the same being that they are seeing in these near-death experiences, that they are being held hugged by in these near-death experiences. I didn't see Jesus, I didn't see God, I didn't hear a voice, I just felt what they felt. I felt what Jesus feels like, and yet I felt it without leaving this world, without having an out-of-body experience, and without taking hallucinogenics. The fact is, while DMT can give you a simulation of a near-death experience, it's just not the same. For instance, they describe experiencing similar emotions, but not nearly as powerfully. And the things that they see are just simply out of this world. And by out of this world, I don't mean awesome. I mean bizarre and nonsensical. Like, these near-death experiences have like a sequence, and they have events, and there's actually, it's a real place. They're describing a real place. But the people who take DMT, they don't see Jesus, they don't see heaven, they see, some see a light, but when you hear them describe their experience, and I've heard dozens of DMT experiences, I've never seen any of them break down and just start crying because of what they experienced. But almost every near-death experiencer, or someone who had any kind of spiritually transformative experience, when they think about it, when they talk about it, they get very emotional. And every time someone takes DMT, it's a different experience. But every near-death experience, they are describing the exact same thing. Sometimes they don't see Jesus, sometimes they just see a light, but they know that this light has an essence, a being, a personality. They still feel the same thing that people feel when they're being hugged and embraced by Jesus. And in fact, every single time people see Jesus, it's after seeing a light first. Once the light comes close to them, they see that it's not just a light, it's a being of light. So it's just not the same as a near-death experience. It's very clear that they're just tripping balls, but the near-death experience is always the same. It starts with an out-of-body experience, and looking down at your body, you feel detached from your body. You look at other people and you see them as souls, but you look at your body and all you see is meat, because there's no soul in that body anymore. So they feel detached from that body. It's more like an object than a person, because the personhood has been removed from the body, and they feel more alive than they've ever felt. They go down a narrow tunnel, and they see a bright light, a billion times brighter than the sun, and yet they can look at it without squinting or anything. And once they get closer to it, they realize that this isn't just a light, that it's a being, because the closer this being gets to them, the more they can feel the presence of said being. Jesus was like literally right there with me in that church when I experienced that. So yeah, they see a tunnel, they see a light, they see Jesus, they experience a life review, and they realize that, you know how people say, my life flashed before my eyes. They see a life review, and that's another thing. When people take DMT, there is no life review, because they're not dead. They're just tripping balls. People who are actually dead have a life review because they are dead. Their life is over. So they experience this life review, and they realize the theme of this life review is how you treat other people. And most of these people who have these life reviews can feel how their actions affected the people around them. Another thing is they see heaven. In heaven, there's a lot of plants. Nothing's reflecting light. Light is coming out of everything. Light is coming out of the flowers. Light is coming out of them. Light is coming out of the buildings. Yes, there's buildings. And that's one of the things I'm most excited about. I want to build something in heaven. I want to build a beautiful tree house or something like that. They describe mountains, they describe rivers and waterfalls, and they describe the sound of the waterfall is like music, praising God. And they describe, and the amazing thing is these accounts and these descriptions are literally identical, not only with each other, but with the writings of ancient prophets and mystics from thousands of years ago, describing the same thing. So yeah, DMT, there's no life review, there's no heaven, everything is hallucination, everything is an illusion. They experience loving beings and stuff like that, but it's not nearly as profound as an actual near-death experience. It's an artificial experience. What these people are actually experiencing, many of these people describe similar landmarks in heaven. People who don't even know each other, people who are separated by decades or even centuries, describe the same things. There are just too many consistent similarities between unconnected sources. Like my experience, for instance, I had never heard of a near-death experience, but when I did hear about them, I realized they were describing something that actually happened to me. So that blew my mind. The next experience happened almost a year later, and it was almost equally powerful. So there are certain Christian denominations that invoke fear in order to manipulate people into converting, saying things like, if you don't believe in Jesus, then he is going to throw you and your whole family in hell forever, which is just nonsense. It's so much deeper than that, and it's not that petty. While I am certain that all Christians will go to heaven, it's not as black and white as simply all non-Christians are going to hell no matter what, because they're not Christians. It's so much deeper than that. And it has to do with our character, and it has to do with the love that we feel for other people, and it has to do with the way that we live our life. If we live to please ourselves, or if we live to make life better for other people. But so anyway, one day, it got to me. These Christians got to me. I saw a video on YouTube that really got to me. And I was terrified for my family because a lot of them aren't Christian. So I went on a walk to the store and praying frantically, absolutely terrified. And as I was praying, I was once again overcome with this overwhelming presence. And this presence was distinctly different than the one that I felt in the church. The presence was not that of God or of Jesus, which are the same thing, but it was my grandmother, my Grandma Karen, who died when my mom was 12, who I never met. I had never met her before, and yet again, I was just overcome with a powerful sense of knowing her intimately, like I knew her very well, just like I did with Jesus. I knew it was her without any audible communication at all. And what she told me was that we would all, my whole family, we would all be with her in heaven when we're done with this world. She told me. She made that promise, and I knew that it was true. I didn't know how to tell my family that I talked to Grandma Karen without sounding nonsensical. But that's just the way that realm behaves. It's so completely different than this world. It's beautiful and perfect. And when I got to the store, the cashier, who was currently checking out the customer in front of me, was talking about, I could see she was pointing up, and it was as if she was talking about God to her customer. And when it was my turn, I asked her, what was she talking about? And she was talking about near-death experiences to the customer. And I was like, what's a near-death experience? And she gave me a video. She told me to look up Jeff Olson, one of these guys that was just in this video. So not only did my Grandma Karen tell me that my whole family would be okay, but when I got home, I watched that video. And through that video, I had so many lifelong questions all answered for me in just under 50 minutes. And it blew my mind. This whole phenomenon blew my mind from the very beginning. And when I got more into these near-death experiences, I realized they're describing something, the very same thing that I experienced in that church, the very same person that I experienced in that church. So the fact that I experienced the same attributes as these near-death experiencers without dying or without taking any drugs is subjective proof to me that this is a real phenomenon that is not merely psychological, and it's not something that can be induced by drugs. It is not something that can be induced by your culture. It is strictly a spiritual phenomenon. It's proof that DMT does not cause these feelings and these experiences during the death. It's just the true nature of God's character and the nature of the laws that govern that spiritual dimension, that higher dimension, that spiritual realm, heaven, whatever you want to call it. So anyway, nobody needs to believe me, or any of the people in this video for that matter, because I know what I know, and these people know what they know. They know it to be true. I know it to be true. Nobody can tell me otherwise. Nobody can make me not believe in God, because I've experienced him. I remember him. I know what he feels like, and I know that billions of people around the world for centuries have been describing the exact same thing all around the world, no matter what country it is, no matter what culture. It's always the same. My joy isn't found in people believing my story. My joy is found in the certainty of my experience, and it's even found even more in being able to change people's lives for the better through sharing my experience, through honestly, genuinely sharing my experience with people. I have nothing to gain. I'm not monetizing these videos. I just want people to know the truth. I am firmly rooted in what I believe, and you are free to believe whatever you want. Person watching this, you can believe whatever you want, and I would support it. But I am here not to condemn anyone, not to say that the way you're living your life is wrong, and not to say that my truth is the only truth, because I recognize that everyone believes what they believe as firmly as I do, as firmly as I believe what I believe. But my only hope is to share my experience, and that the people listening to it will allow it to impact their lives in some way. That's all I want. I have studied over 100 of the most profound stories and unbelievable stories in this phenomenon, and the evidence is overwhelming. I would have to take an hour of your time to go through all of it, because there's just so much, and maybe I will in the future. But all I want is for people to know the reality of this, and to consider the possibility that maybe death is not the end. It's the beginning. That maybe this earthly life, in light of eternity, is infinitesimally insignificant. That all this earthly life is is just the fallopian tube, and that when you die, that is when you are really born into the real world. The universe as it really is what a lot of near-death experiencers describe. I want people to know the reality of this, but I don't need them to. In fact, some people are perfectly content in being unsure, uncertain. Some people are completely content with not knowing. But I've concluded that what these people are describing is not something psychological. They are describing a real place, a real dimension, an alternate universe with real laws that govern that realm and operate completely differently than the way they operate here. These laws and these experiences that people are just trying to put it into words. It's like describing colors to someone who's blind or who's never seen. You can't describe heaven without someone who's been there. You can't describe the presence of God unless you felt it yourself. And that's what I want people to know. So yeah, I hope this video impacted you in some positive way. Thank you for watching this video. Have an awesome day.